After 2 decades of being frozen out economically, the thaw has begun.
I believe that lifting of U.S. sanctions will encourage people to use legal channels to exchange money, even within the banking system, so people will not go to the black market.
Washington says it's confident that Sudan has done enough to have the trade embargo lifted, but it will still be considered a country that supports terrorism, alongside Syria and Iran. The US also says President Omar al-Bashir, who once played host to Osama bin Laden, still faces charges of genocide at the International Criminal Court. So why have sanctions been lifted? Well, Washington says the government in Khartoum is making gains. Relations with its neighbours, including South Sudan, are better, and aid organisations are allowed in to help those wounded in conflict zones. But is it really any better for the average Sudanese family?
I take 2 spoons of milk and give my kids 3 spoons, or 1 spoon for my husband and I, in order to give the kids 2 spoons for their nutritional needs.
Sudan has already been getting help from abroad for years. China controls around 75% of the oil sector, and Malaysia and India are looking to grow their investments there. Saudi Arabia and its neighbours also heavily depend on Sudan for their wheat, since the nation is the breadbasket of Africa. But are the biggest superpowers ignoring what's really happening for their own gain? Human Rights Watch said in Darfur, southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, government forces attack civilians, forcing tens of thousands of people to flee. And protests have also been quashed across the country, including at several university campuses. So will opening Sudan up economically actually lead to social change, or will it be business as usual for the country's government? Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Zach Verton. He was a U.S. State Department official under President Barack Obama and is now a visiting lecturer of international affairs at Princeton University. And in London, we have Jonathan Offel-Ansah. He's the founder and publisher of Africa Briefing. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Zach, if I can begin with you, is the lifting of those sanctions on Sudan a good thing?
I think so, Imran. Anyone that looks at Sudan and its government's long history of violent rule will agree that change is necessary. The question is how. And I think for too long, Washington pursued a policy of punishment only. And I think this lifting of sanctions is an attempt to continue a policy that began under Barack Obama to chart a more nuanced, smarter policy that couples both engagement and pressure. Yeah, interestingly, one of the few times Donald Trump seems to be following through on something that Barack Obama has started. Jonathan Offel-Ansah, more carrot than stick, is that the way to go with Sudan?
Yes, and I also actually agree with the other gentleman that I'm surprised, the Trump administration has decided to lift the sanctions, and pleasantly so, I must say, because the sanctions, were crippling the Sudanese economy, for no justifiable reason at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's try and sort of step back for a second and go, maybe the sanctions were bad, right? The sanctions could have been absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I remember being there in 2008, I think, when the national airliner went down and crash landed in Khartoum, and more than 30 people died. Many people blamed the sanctions and the fact that the airline didn't have good parts. So whether the sanctions were good or bad, let's make that immaterial for the moment, Zach. And let me ask you, has Sudan done enough to deserve better treatment?
I think they've done enough to start a new round of engagement, and that's what this is about. And I'd remind viewers that this was never meant to be a once-off. I think we should view the announcement from the Trump administration as the beginning of a new round of engagement, not as the finish line. Look, Khartoum still wants plenty of things from Washington and the rest of the Western world. They want the state sponsor of terrorism designation lifted. They want normalization of diplomatic relations, and they want to get out from a crushing amount of debt, something on the order of $50 billion. So now Washington is in position to use this new round of engagement, and they should immediately take forward a kind of phase 2 and make bigger asks for what they'd like to see in terms of continuing change in Sudan, both continuation of what's happened so far as well as greater gains in terms of a long-term political process.
Yeah, there seems to be a contradiction at play here, because we're hearing that one of the reasons for the delisting was that Sudan is cooperating when it comes to the fight against terror, but Sudan is still listed as a state sponsor of terror. Let's have a little listen to Sudan's Foreign Minister, Ibrahim Ahmed Ghandour. He had something to say about this.
It is ironic that we are among the best countries in combating terrorism, while still included on the list of countries harboring terrorism. I have been saying repeatedly, this is a paradox. We are still included on the list while we are the best in combating terrorism. However, it is politics. It's not about humiliation, but rather about politics. Many times, you should cope with the detriments and deal with the reality accordingly. There is no need to be overly brave. It's not useful. Being pragmatic will help us more.
So, Jonathan, tell me about that contradiction and where you stand on this paradox.
Yes, it's a contradiction. I mean, if Sudan, well, to use a euphemism, has come up from the cold, out enough for the U.S. to lift sanctions, why are they still on the lists, of terrorist sponsoring countries? So it's it's a contradiction in terms, if I can say that. Okay, so I believe, but I think that this is the first step, in normalizing, or reestablishing full relations, economic, political relations with Sudan. I believe it's a first step. So we have to see what next step the Trump administration will take.
Jonathan, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what Alan Ngari, a senior researcher at ISS, the Institute for Security Studies, had to say, writing in, or quoted in Daily Maverick, saying this was a measure of duplicity, that the humanitarian condition continues to deteriorate with little or no access by humanitarian organizations and CSOs into areas such as Darfur. There's documentation of ongoing violations of human rights and serious crimes taking place there. And he goes on to cite Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others, talking about the fact that there's still some very bad things happening at the hands of the Sudanese army under the control of Omar al-Bashir in places like Darfur, which the world seems to have forgotten about, yet Sudan is coming in from the cold. What's going on there, Jonathan?
Bad things happen everywhere, okay? We know how many blacks have been killed by the police, right? And the police gone scot-free in the U.S., okay? No country is 100%, can I say?
But come on, Jonathan, that's a really, I mean, that analogy is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, police killings in the U.S. versus a situation like Darfur. Are you seriously comparing the two?
Yes, I'm comparing the two because if you say, I mean, some places are inaccessible, there are human rights being trampled upon, and so on and so forth. What about what is happening in your own backyard?
Yeah, certainly. But,
okay.
But we're talking about, 250,000 people killed versus police engagement with some, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I mean, okay, you've made the analogy. I don't think it's one that fits, but let me then just focus away from the analogy and focus on the fact that Darfur hasn't been solved. So what are we going to do? Just throw those people under the bus in Darfur and say, well, Sudan's coming from the cold. It's a U.S. ally now. Bad things happen everywhere.
No, Darfur, I believe, will be solved, but it's not a problem that could be solved overnight. Okay, like I said earlier on, lifting of the economic sanctions is the first step, right, in the positive engagement between the U.S. and Sudan. So I believe, I'm hopeful that with this lifting of the sanctions, further engagement will take place, right, and solutions found for the Darfur situation.
Zach Vertin, the fact that a way to look at this is not so much that the U.S. removes sanctions on Sudan, but it can be extended to the U.S. removes sanctions against the regime of Omar al-Bashir, wanted by the International Criminal Court suspected on 5 counts of crimes against humanity, 2 counts of war, 3 counts of genocide. It doesn't look very good, does it?
I wouldn't say. I'd say it's a far cry to say that this measure means that the U.S. and Sudan are allies. Again, there's a long way to go in Sudan, both in terms of its domestic conflicts and in terms of long-term political transformation. And I can tell you, those were the things. Those 2 objectives were what ignited this policy shift under Barack Obama and has continued here. So again, I don't think we should view this as a finish line. This does not mean everything is hunky-dory in Sudan. There's a long way to go. And I think the Trump administration should build on these recent gains, build on this opportunity, build on the leverage it now has to extract further gains. Again, I mentioned the things that are outlined and that Sudan wants, and President Trump should make clear that the path to normalization will, again, need to see substantial increasing changes.
Okay, so Zach, help me understand. What has Sudan done? Can you give me an example of something that they've done that has pleased the Americans?
Sure, and I don't think this should be unduly focused on counterterrorism operations. As I mentioned, an end to the domestic wars and internal domestic change is what started this policy. There were 5 tracks, which include an end to military offensives in the identified areas, increase of humanitarian access, as well as cooperation on regional issues and counterterrorism fronts. There's been progress, as documented in the State Department report, in all of those areas. That said, there's a long way to go. Again, this is about digging out of a hole of mutual mistrust and getting to a place where both sides that they can show that they can deliver. We've done that. We've done that now. The task is where to go from here.
Zach, has Sudan agreed to distance itself from Iran?
Say that again?
Has Sudan agreed to distance itself from Iran as part of this shift in relations?
That was not explicitly part of the package. Okay. Certainly the Sudanese had in the previous year and a half taken it upon themselves to distance from Iran. Certainly there were concerns inside the administration also about distancing from North Korea. Those were not explicitly part of this package, but I know that they're pieces of the puzzle.
Okay, I'm glad that...
and so I think the trick...
Go ahead.
No, the trick is now that the Sudanese, as I mentioned, there are things that they continue to want from Washington. That puts the United States in a position of leverage, which it did not achieve through a policy of punishment.
Right.
The pressure alone did not force changes in Khartoum, and in time it placed undue strain on ordinary civilians. Again, we all agree that drastic change is necessary in Sudan. The question is how to go about it and what kind of time frame we should be thinking about in terms of achieving that change.
Certainly, and I'm glad Zach mentioned North Korea as a possible piece of the puzzle, because multiple reports coming out saying that, Jonathan, that Sudan had agreed to stop buying weapons from North Korea because it did in 2013. That was well documented. And I read that and I think, Jonathan, come on, how low is the bar here? Stop buying weapons from North Korea for the sanctions to be lifted. Is that how low the bar is, Jonathan?
Well, I think so, yes, because in life, generally, you do not get something for nothing, right? You give something and you get something back. So maybe that was part of the bargaining chip that, the Trump administration had to use. And like I said, Sudan has been reeling for the economic sanctions. So something had to give. So they had to give something in order to receive something.
Right. And Jonathan, Sudan seemed to have caused some trouble for South Sudan during the time that it had broken away after it had its independence referendum with Abyei and so on. Has there been enough evidence that Khartoum has backed off enough? I mean, South Sudan itself is a complete mess at the moment and worth addressing for the entire international community. But has there been enough evidence, Jonathan, that Khartoum has backed off and isn't meddling in the business of South Sudan?
I don't know, how much meddling Khartoum, is doing in South Sudan. But I believe that, no matter what, if there's any meddling at all, I believe it's subsided.
Zach, does Sudan still deserve to be on the list of state sponsors of terror?
I understand that's a review that's ongoing. I can't speak to that. It's a designation made by the intelligence community. I do believe that's ongoing, but I can't speak to that. It's long been a political football. The law itself says that they must bar any kind of cooperation with any designated organizations for a period of at least 6 months. I imagine that will be part of the review going forward. And again, should be part of a larger package of items and a larger package of asks that the Trump administration now takes.
Do you feel that they've...
Let this not end here.
Certainly. Do you feel they've improved on human rights?
I think there's a long way to go. I think there's a long way to go. I think the measurable change in the areas identified was enough to get both the Obama administration and the Trump administration to take this first step. But certainly human rights should be part of the package long term. But again, the best way to answer an end to conflicts domestically, the best way to address concerns about religious freedom and human rights is a political transformation. And this policy is in part attempted to help set that or to assist the Sudanese people in taking that forward. But again, this is going to be a long-term prospect.
Jonathan, are we going to be seeing a political transformation unfold now?
Well, yes. I mean, a journey of 1,000 steps, miles begin with one step. So this, I believe, is the first step in seeing, some sort of transformation in the long term, in the long run.
Okay. Zach Vertin and Jonathan Offel Ansah, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.